Well, we almost made it. We're almost there. The fourth Sunday of talking about how is fasting cultivate an intimate relationship with our God. So we're getting there. I mean, it's not really, because next week we got to talk about study. So this is good. So here's my question I want you to think about this morning to start. What has been your experience with suffering? Your own, but also those around you who are suffering. Maybe it comes from poverty. Just take a moment. What comes to mind? What's immediate that comes to your mind? I would say most recently for me is when we traveled to Rwanda. I knew I was going to a third world country I've never been before. I knew that we would encounter poverty. I knew we were covering suffering. I've heard the stories. And so we were well prepared by our leaders to how do we enter into that suffering? And right away, it just sort of grips you that people are living on so much less and in such a different way than we are. We'd go to visit, we'd see this most profoundly when we go visit people's homes, and that you would go down these dirt roads, and then we'd go on these dirt paths, and then you'd be in these collection of homes, and then you go inside and you would sit down with the family, and it would be a dirt floor, and you were sitting on these like hand-hewn benches. It was a different way of life. And people were definitely struggling to get by. I remember one mother, I think it was Clementine, and her daughter Antoinette. And we went in to visit them, and their dad had left, and he'd been abusive. And so Antoinette, because she was disabled, she had to live in the darkness of her home. She was ashamed to her family, and people disconnected from them, and they were suffering that isolation and that despair. But hope had come in, and we got to visit with them and sit with them and see that transformation. But just to be with that was a different experience for me. I've seen a lot of poverty in the world. I've seen a lot of poverty in the United States. I've worked with it in urban cities a lot. But that suffering, that human struggle and the despair that comes with it. See, here in the United States, we can easily kind of ignore that. I do it in my life. I can just walk by it, and I don't have to see it. I can just ignore it, or I can create in my head a reason why I have nothing to do with it, and I'm not responsible for these people. I think about Golden, and I think about, is there poverty in Golden? Is there suffering in Golden? And the answer is yes. Just this week, Tricia and I went, and we were sitting with some people with the Together Church, and someone told a story about the Salvation Army. When the back to school event, there was this one young girl. She was coming up and she didn't have shoes on, and somebody says, why didn't she have shoes on? Why don't you have your shoes on? And somebody talked to her real quick and said, she can't afford shoes. So right there's just that little story that it is around us when we pay attention. I think of Molly Roth, our former in-house saint. She would go on Saturdays to the Methodist Church to work with people who are suffering homelessness. And she didn't go there to serve food. She didn't go there to help hand things out. She went there to create a table that she called a listening post, and she would sit down with these people. And she would hear their stories. She'd kind of learn where they're coming from. She knew their names. She saw them. She knew them. She was in solidarity with them in a small way. Molly Roth. Last week I attempted to ground the practice of fasting into the sacrificial love of God exhibited on Jesus in the cross, and in a small way wondered, could we embrace and enter the suffering that Christ suffered on the cross in just a small way, and could that influence our faith and strengthen us in faith in some way? Now today we approach fasting from a bit of a different angle. Just as Jesus came to be in solidarity with us, he came to be in solidarity with all the creatures of this earth. And the call and invitation for us who are disciples, who want to seek and apprentice our lives after Jesus, those of us who call him Lord, it corresponds to that we will be folks who follow his way. And his way embraces or draws near to people who are suffering in some way. You might say we all suffer in some manner, and I think you'd be right in saying that. Now, in Jesus' life, though, we saw him engaging with people who suffered sickness, who suffered poverty, hunger, people who were ruled by evil forces, people who suffered loneliness. He drew in the outcasts, the sinners, and those sort of folks that just didn't quite fit the bill. Now, a friend of mine, he likes to say that Jesus, whenever he was in ministry, he always had a person in mind wherever he went. And so for Jesus, at the front and center of what he was doing and his engagement with the world were people that he would see and recognize and speak to and witness to the present, inbreaking, loving reign of God. Do you remember the woman in Samaria by the well? This was a woman suffering shame and outcast, the struggle of being sort of seen unworthy in your community. And Jesus sits down with her and talks with her, engages with her, and speaks the good news to her. Do you remember the woman caught in adultery? And the religious leaders of the day, they want to bring her before Jesus. And they want Jesus to be part of that. They want to ring her up. And Jesus has nothing to do with that because he sees the woman. He sees the person, and he won't play their games. He won't. He draws near to this woman's suffering. Now, tax collectors in Jesus' day, they were scum. They were betraying their people by being in cahoots with the Roman Empire. They were in it for their own self-interest, and they were looked down upon, and they had to suffer that shame and isolation in their community. But when Jesus sees Zacchaeus up in that tree, he goes and he sits down, and he has dinner with them, and he eats with them. Now, you've heard me say it before. When you break bread with someone, it is an intimate act of seeing the other and being with the other human being. Jesus is always moving towards his neighbors in love and kindness and invites us to do the same. Now, remember, a month ago, I talked about at the end of prayer how we want to see our neighborhoods, and that neighborhoods aren't necessarily just where we live, although that's an important place, but neighborhoods are the circles in which we find ourselves in our everyday, on a regular basis, building community with people. That can be places that you hang out with. That can be groups that you do your favorite hobby or activity with. That can be where you go to school. That can be where you play. What are those circles in those neighborhoods? And the question is, last week, how do we enter into suffering with Jesus through fasting? And this week, how can fasting be a way for us to enter into a deeper solidarity with our neighbors at a spiritual level, with those in our neighborhoods, our circles, who we know are suffering in some way? And what I really want us to see, and there are several things, but the first is that Jesus practiced, like Jesus' practices were to, again, cultivate intimacy at a personal level with the Trinity. John says, talks about as abiding. It's about remaining in Christ as Christ remains in us. It's living a life connected to the living God. And to come into such an abiding reality, to enter this kingdom, the present reality where God is ruling and reigning and Jesus is Lord. It's not just to be transformed by this intimacy for ourselves. Although that will happen, because when you come in contact with the beauty and the love and the joy of this God, you will be transformed from the inside out. But that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. To come in contact with a God of love and compassion and mercy is to then go and look at the world with compassion and mercy, and to say, I am part of what God is doing. And that song we sang, Hope of a Broken Lord, arise, right? The glory of the Lord is shining in us and then sending us out to be his people into this world. To follow Jesus means to move into the suffering of people. So can fasting help us in some small way to be in solidarity with people who are suffering in some way? That we can respond to these people as Jesus would respond, to come alongside of people as Jesus came alongside of people, to be comfort, to be healers, to be witness, to be hope bearers, to be light, to be witness of God's reality for them. So we come into the life of the Trinity, which is the New Testament is transformative. It's simultaneously sending us into and amongst a world where there's suffering and people who are suffering. Now, when I look at us and I look at our community of Jesus followers, I'm always really struck by this mission guide that Tricia put together. There are 28 passion-based ministries. And what we define a passion-based ministries in our church is if somebody has a passion where they feel like their heart is breaking for something that's breaking God's heart in the world, that they would say, is God calling me to do something with him, calling me to participate in that? So we have 28 of those. And then they come to the leadership of the church and said, I have this thing and I have these folks and we want to do this and we want to discern with you and say yes. And how do we support you and encourage you? I mean, in and through these 28 passion-based ministries, we are in solidarity in some way with people here in Golden, in our state, in our region, in our nation, and across the globe. Single mothers who need a ride to get to work and to do their mothering. Children who need clothes to begin the school year. Love with Actions who are helping families who are suffering to help them, strengthen them, empower them, and to help them along the way. There are so many ways of these 28 passion-based ministries. If you have not looked at this, then you need to, and you need to read it. And you just need to see where God might be inviting you into all of that. And I also want us to pay attention to the people in our everyday neighborhoods, those circles. Be on the lookout. Be asking the Spirit, who are those people? Who are those people who need a word of hope, who are lonely, who are struggling? Because they are out there. And we know that. Why? Because we know it ourselves. And so what we want to look at our neighbors with is empathy and compassion because it's been extended to us in God. Now, in the Old Testament, Isaiah is writing to the people of Israel. And Israel, of course, if you don't know, Israel is the nation, the Jewish nation that God calls out and forms. And he promises to be their God and to come alongside of them. And it's not just so that they know God, it's so that they would be witnesses to all nations of what it looks like to be a people under sort of the rule of this God. And so they've come to a place, though, in their life together where things aren't right. They have kind of lost their way. Their worship has become self-serving. Their fasting and other rituals like that have just become ritualistic. They're empty. They're self-serving. They think they're earning righteousness. They've lost touch of their relationship with God. And they're thinking it's all in their religion. And to this is what Isaiah says to his people. Is not this kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Now, he's talking about Jews there, but Jesus won't let us off the hook either with that. When he says, who's your neighbor? Your neighbor is anyone around you. We're all created in the same flesh and blood. There's no longer Jew and Gentile, right? We're all one. We've all been created by the same God. And our heart is to be for how do we, in our faith, begin to say, how do we have compassion and mercy to those around us? So this week, I'm suggesting that we fast one more time. Now, again, the outlines are there. I had my thing somewhere. It's just been one of those kind of days, but here it is. So there's some questions to kind of go through on the front. But the idea is sort of, if you need the guidelines, they're back there on a sheet. But the idea is you to fast in solidarity with a suffering neighbor. Before you fast, really ask the Spirit to bring to your mind a people group or a people or support of one of our passion-based ministries. And while you fast, commit to praying for your suffering neighbor. And when you feel symptoms of fasting, remember, those symptoms can cue you to pray for these folks. And somehow try to learn about these people. Somehow that could be on a website. That could be taking a neighbor out to lunch. That could just be speaking to a leader of one of these organizations about what can you learn more. And be aware of what's happening in your heart. Be aware of what maybe God's wanting and calling you to do. And then process this experience. I mean, remember, we're just experimenting with these things. But the idea is, how do we just know that we can be in solidarity with those who suffer by suffering just a missed meal or two, to sort of join them in that effort? And can that change our hearts? And can that draw us closer to God? Can we then see God's heart for those who are struggling in this world? Let's see. So let me just wrap up this month with a few of my own observations. Remember, my whole idea was that I would read Celebration of Disciplines. I'd experiment with the disciplines to see how they could build up my relationship with God, draw me closer to God, and I was going to experiment with that, and then I had the great idea that I was going to invite you into that process. So this is a little bit of that. I think it does help cultivate my relationship with God. That has been my experience this month. It does help me remove distractions. Right? I rely on food, for all of life. But take that away, and I find myself able to focus more clearly on God. I did a week-long fast of television, and that was not hard. But what I found is I was more open, I was more available, I was more present to what God was doing amongst me. That leads me to my second point, and that's fasting has helped me experience some of my disordered attachments, my allegiances to things that I've given too much allegiance to. I enjoy watching television, but when I fasted, I realized that that's a way I distance myself through television. It's a way that I can not be present. It's a way that I can not pay attention to what God's doing. And this way, the fast helped wake me to God and to being present with God's doing around me. I would say this. I think you really need to have a plan. You need to plan it out. You have to think through your strategy. You got to come up with the things that you'll need. What prayers will help you? Do you need a playlist of worship songs to help you for the hard moments? Do you need to, what do you need? But I really think we need a landing plan. Because we can get that plane up in the air and we can get up there, but then how do you bring it to its end? When I came back from Hawaii, I fasted on the plane, and I got home, and as soon as I got home, I opened the refrigerator, and I just devoured anything in sight. I don't think that's the point, right? But it's just how do you enter into it and just more mindfully in that sense. And then lastly, I'm just learning that the Spirit, when I fast, the Spirit is just cultivating in me a greater self-control and a greater self-discipline. So I see that fruit being grown in me. So friends, next month we're going to start with study, and we'll see where we go with that. So I'm looking forward to that. And I would just say this: God is alive. And not as an idea, but as an eternal being, calling us spiritual beings into an eternal way of living now that stretches throughout eternity. And there are ways and practices that we can enter and be intentional about that life. So let me pray. Lord God, we just thank you for the practice of fasting, Jesus. You fasted for 40 days. You lived intimately with your Father and the Spirit, and we want to do the same. So I ask that you would bless each of our times as we fast this week, that you would put on each of our hearts a specific people or a group, and that as we fast and offer that to you, that you would somehow work and bless that you would strengthen us and give us eyes and ears to see how you are making all things right in this world and inviting us to join in. We give you thanks and praise, Jesus. Amen.